The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. Look for The Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and today I'm sharing with you a conversation I had with author Debra Magpie Earling, who is the author of a new novel that's just come out called The Lost Journals of Sacajewea. In this conversation, she explains who Sacajewea was and how she's understood, but I just want to let everybody know who isn't from the US. Maybe you haven't heard of this story before. I hadn't really until I started reading her novel and researching it a little bit. So Sacajewea herself was an Indigenous woman from the Americas, and then she became a guide to Lewis and Clark, who were two white men who were traveling around mapping parts of what is now the United States for various reasons. And we do explain more about the story during the episode, but it's a person who I would compare her historical impact and the amount of mythology around her and the kind of misunderstanding and how she's sometimes seen as a villain to similar to when I had the episode about Malincine, the Indigenous woman from Mexico. It's a similar sort of story, right, of an Indigenous woman who ends up becoming a helper in some ways to some white men. And in so doing, then her own story gets buried a little bit by people who just want to say, like, the white men were so great. So then we have to assume that she was happy to help them. And that's very much not the case in either of those situations. So Debra really explains during this where she was coming from in terms of Sacagawea's story, but also just about Debra herself. She is the author of a previous novel as well called Perma Red, and an earlier version of the Lost Journals of Sacajewea was produced as an artist book during the bicentennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition. She has received both a National Endowment for the Arts grant and a Guggenheim Fellowship. She retired from the University of Montana, where she was named Professor Emeritus in 2021. She is Bitterroot Salish, and she's also I do these author interviews on this podcast, and she's the first author who I contacted to say, hi, my name is Anne. I do this podcast called Vulgar History. She's the first author I contacted who was like, yeah, I know, I am in the Tits Out Brigade. Like Debra she's a longtime listener of the podcast. And so it was really great to connect with her on that level as well. We had such a fun conversation. And I really think that you'll enjoy hearing more about her book and about kind of reclaiming the story of Sacajewea. So, Debra Magpie Earling, I'm so excited to talk to you. And you were just saying you're familiar with this podcast.
Yes, I am thrilled to be here. And thank you so much for inviting me.
I was excited because I just told you this before we started recording, but you're the first author who I reached out to, and I didn't have to explain, here's who I am. This is my podcast. You already knew who I was.
Yes, absolutely. And I love your podcast, and I love all the information. And I always use a journal to keep notes so that I can go and look up what people are talking about. There's so much, you cover so much in each and every one of your podcasts. So I just, I'm thrilled to be on this. I'm honored. Thank you.
That's so exciting. I'm so honored to be talking to you as well. And I was thinking, and I'm pretty sure this is the first American woman that I've ever discussed on the podcast, and how perfect that it's like an Indigenous first American.
Yes. Yay. Thank you.
So you were here to talk about your novel that's just coming out when this podcast comes out. I think the book will just have been published. It's coming out in May. So
Yes.
The Lost Journals of Sacajewea. And can you first explain to me the journey of how you came to write this novel? Because I think it was, what was it? It was a poetry project first?
Actually, before that time, I was commissioned by the historian Alvin Giuseppe to write a piece, Lewis and Clark Through Indian Eyes. So as a Bitterroot Salish woman, I was to tell the story of, our encounters with Lewis and Clark. So as I was doing sort of the research for that project, that essay, I came across something that just stayed with me, and I couldn't let it go. It was just kind of, I'd heard so many, you hear the mythology of Sacajewea, but then when you get down into the grit of those journals, which everyone seems to like kind of pass over and not really examine, so many historians just, I don't know whether they ignore this, but they don't usually account for this. And if I may, the thing that snagged me in the journals, may I read that selection?
Yes, please.
Okay, it's from Clark, and it's on November 22nd of 1804. And he says, I was alarmed about 10 o'clock by the sentinel who informed that an Indian was about to kill his wife in the interpreter's fire. I went down and spoke to the fellow about the rash act which he was like to commit, and forbid any act of the kind near the fort. He goes on to say that one of his sergeants had slept with the wife, and if he wanted to, he could kill her. And so it goes on to say that later she shows up by the interpreter's fire. She came to the interpreter's fire apparently much beat and stabbed in 3 places. And then later he says, Clark in the same sort of tone, and I advised him to take his squaw home and live happily together in the future. And so, I was like, well, there's so much there packed in that just one little excerpt from their journals. But the thing that really grabbed me was, who was like the interpreter's fire? Well, that wouldn't have been Charbonneau. That would have had to have been Sacajewea, right? And so I thought about like her as a young woman facing this woman who has been stabbed and beaten by her husband, and most likely murdered after they left, after, they went on their journey. So I took that bit of information and I began to really look at the ways in which women were treated and how colonialism had kind of fostered a whole new way of seeing the world. One of the things that bothers me about it was, if we refocus that lens of colonialism and slavery on the life of Sacajewea, it just fractures a fundamental and foundational myth of the American West, which was, Lewis and Clark were on this grand expedition, and they were, but they also endangered so many lives. And really, since the coming of Lewis and Clark, Indigenous women have been murdered, raped, sexualized, sold into slavery for money, conquest, and power. And I think that Sacajewea for me was like the first trafficked woman. She was captured by the Hidatsas in one account, and she was taken to Knife River, where she was gambled or sold to Charbonneau. And they continued to refer to her as his wife, which I find really troubling. And I was hoping that this book would open that conversation about ideas of women in the West, especially Native women, who were sold or bartered to white fur trappers, and they were considered like less than beaver pelts. And then they were referred to as wives when they clearly didn't want to marry these men and were subjected to them and had to live with them.
I just wanted to mention, and wasn't she incredibly young at the time also?
Here's something that really, when I started, I'm no historian and good goodness, I'm no anthropologist. But when I began to open up the whole narrative, they say, these historians will say that Sacajewea is born circa 1788. So circa means, circulatory. It could be as much as 10 years, but most likely it was 3 or 4 years, give or take. So she could have been 8 or 9, or she could have been 16. Most likely she was younger. And the reason why I thought she was younger is because Clark's fiance at the time that he left Virginia was 12 years old. So 11 or 12 years old. And I thought, it pardons the Corps, the expedition, if she is 16, or possibly they push the historians have traditionally pushed her age up so that she is 16, 17, 18. But, and to think of her as a child with child is kind of unthinkable, and certainly not a wholesome depiction of the expedition.
The whole situation is obviously awful. And there's an added level if you're picturing a pregnant 18-year-old versus a pregnant 12-year-old.
Yes.
It's just, there's something just so much more chilling in a different way to have her be that young. Yeah.
To have her be that young. And so, when I read through the journals, I started looking at her. So there's not much written about Sacajewea, and there's not much information in the journals themselves. When they do show her, she's plucky, I guess is the word. She's literally plucky. She plucks out their instruments from the water when everybody is freaking out about like these big waves washing over their barge and all of their stuff is floating away. And so Sacajewea has the peace of mind to grab these things and pull them in. But I thought, okay, she's a mother. She has a baby probably on her back. And it didn't strike me as a woman who would behave that way. An older woman would behave that way. A more mature person would behave that way. Kids are kind of fearless about things, that what frightens others makes them laugh. And I just thought that some of the things when they capture her within the journals, I kept thinking about how I had to find her. I had to search for the real flesh and blood Sacajewea and wrest her from the mythology and try to find out what she would be thinking. And certainly when I look at her whole story, when I look at the ways in which the cultural misinterpretations, because, so Lewis and Clark were gathering all of these things, like sacred things. They gathered a sacred box and they sent it of the Blackfeet, and they sent it back to the Great White Father. They put not a magpie, they kind of folded it in under the skin of a fox and sent it back. And to me, like I was thinking about medicine bundles and the power of those things and how they talked about the Great White Father. So to this young girl who was in this camp, what was that like? What did that mean to her? Was she questioning those things? Like, who are these men and what are they really doing? And they arrive with their big guns in full regalia. They're standing up and shooting off their guns when they come into Mandan camp. I mean, they're a spectacle. They're a sight to behold. And, York, the man enslaved to Clark since he was a young man, sounds like he was just formidable, another sight to behold. And when he stepped forward, he said, I'm a monster and I'm going to eat you. And he said this to the children and they ran away from him. And, and Clark was kind of upset that he got so much attention. So there's all these places where I was reading in the journals between the lines about the jealousies and about the things that were happening to the women that just seemed to be run of the mill. Like they didn't even really talk about that. Wasn't important. The stories weren't important, but you can kind of tell when they do tell a story, because these men weren't creative. I mean, they were war men. They weren't imagining that these events were happening. They were, kind of doggedly reporting them. These historical events take on, if we do look through that lens of this is a contemporary culture, if we look back, it really is kind of startling to see not only what they all went through, but what she must have gone through as a young woman. Some of the accounts are incredible. I mean, there's one account where, and I was thinking, just as a woman, I don't care if you're 12 years old or you're 23, if you're traveling with 34 men, ends up being 34 men when they reach Fort Clatsop. If you're traveling in the company of a man who beats you and in the company of other men who have proven to be randy in every occasion where they stop, and they engage with Native people, then you're a young girl with a child, you're a young woman with a child, and you're confronted with these men who are stopping their canoe to watch grizzlies copulate. And this is in the journals, and I thought, how frightening to see, just to behold grizzlies copulating in the first place. They're massive beasts. And they have these men all around you tittering and laughing. And you're there, as vulnerable as you can be, trying to protect yourself. Another thing that I always thought was really curious, and as I was reading it, I don't know, you kind of, and I'm guilty of this too, just swallowing history that has been given to me or spoon-fed to me about Lewis and Clark for years. I mean, all of the signs of, we have signs that point to, all these signs of Lewis and Clark with their fingers raised, their arms raised, and they're pointing at something. They're discovering the Great West. They're opening up the land. They're following manifest destiny and following God's desire for them to conquer, the people, the West, to name everything, to touch everything, which really is such an amazing kind of journey. In 2 years, they traveled over 8,000 miles on land and by water. They went through, landscapes that were harsh and brutal, and they faced grizzly bears. And I mean, by some accounts, there was one where Meriwether Lewis describes this grizzly bear that was coming at him and was relentless. He shot at this bear, I don't know how many times, and he started to feel that perhaps the land itself was enchanted, because there were things that he just didn't understand. And you think about these people coming into this great landscape where the salmon were so thick in the rivers because they were cultivated by the native people, who tended to the rivers and the waters and the animals, that they could walk across the backs of these of salmon. Just this land that must have seemed to them at times like this truly enchanted place, this place that, unbelievable. So to make this journey myself, trying to understand this young woman and what she was seeing and what she was going through and what she must have felt was horrendous at times. I felt a weight of it, and I didn't expect that at all.
As someone I'm in Canada, you grew up in the United States. What was your understanding of Sacajewea when you were growing up? What were you taught about her?
I was taught that she was a guide and that she was this sweet kind of conformist person who had helped Lewis and Clark open the West to settlement, and that she was a key figure in that. I was also told that she didn't understand English and didn't speak English or French. And I'd always seen statues of her when I was younger. Now there's new statues of her where she is younger, but they had statues of her where she looked like she was a really matronly 40-year-old woman. And I think that, that's a deliberate thing. But as I was reading this, it just occurred to me, as I was reading the journals, as I was reading all this material, like everything that I could get my hands on, it occurred to me that how could she not speak English? how could she not understand what they were saying? I mean, I was in France for 2 weeks and I like began to understand what they were saying. If she's married or she's with Charbonneau and he's mistreating her, it behooves her to understand everything that he's saying. Because clearly, if you're in that situation, you would understand. You would understand the language and fairly quickly. And she was so young that it would have been even more easy for her to understand that language. I mean, the language that she spoke, the Hidatsa and Shoshone, these languages are difficult languages, and she understood and could interpret those. So clearly, she had a knack for understanding language. She had a gift.
And how long was the Lewis and Clark expedition? Did you say it was like 2 years or a year or something?
It was 2 years. It was 2 years, over 8,000 miles. Yeah, it was from May 14th, 1804 to September 23rd, 1806.
So I can't imagine that she would be in this situation for 2 years and not pick up the language. That just sounds impossible.
Well, even for a short time, right?
Yeah.
Like you would just understand what they were saying. If you're in a company of, people who are dangerous and you have to watch out, you would pick up, I would think really fast. But I would say almost all of the historical accounts that I have read, they say she doesn't speak English, or she doesn't understand. She doesn't understand French. And I was like, I just can't, I just don't believe it. It seems like it, and it's so insulting, really, to her intelligence. I mean, the kinds of things that she could do, the type of things that she remembered from her tribe and what she had been taught by the Hidatsas and the Mandans. Remarkable person.
Well, I just think, again, like not having grown up being taught about this story, but it seems to me, having read your book and now talking to you, it seems like that's another way to sort of, for people to not have to confront her as a human being. If you're like, well, she was along, but she didn't talk, she didn't understand, then it's like, okay, well, then it's almost like she's a pet. Like you don't have to think about her as her humanity.
That's a brilliant insight. Yes. Absolutely. I think that's the way that we have carved a place in history. We have not questioned these stories at all. We have accepted that, that she was sort of an invisible person or a helpmate. But certainly she didn't have an identity, really, nor did she have sovereignty, which is entirely not true. When she gets back to the Shoshone, the Lemhi Shoshone, she begins to just weep inconsolably. She begins to cry. She sucks her fingers. She's surrounded by these people. Meriwether Lewis is astonished that she has any emotion at all. And which just strikes me again as how she was traumatized and couldn't reveal any emotion, had to be so laced up during this time. She was probably shocked by all the things that were going on and couldn't express herself. What happened, though, that I love about her, and what seems to me that she does assert her sovereignty, she does assert her identity. She claims, if the Hidatsas claim that she was one of their own, but if that's true, it seems to me that she really desired to be with the Lemhi Shoshone, that her emotional soul was with them. And when the man that she was to marry said, I won't accept you because you have a baby by a white man, she shunned him. She said, she got, and I don't know how she told them this. She got on the horse and she said, I'm going to see the ocean. She communicated that in Hidatsa. And the communication method was really fraud because she had to speak to Charbonneau in Hidatsa. He had to translate that somehow through French and then through English and then through Clark or Meriwether Lewis. And that just seems also clunky and not really believable at all. I just admire her so much that she finally liberated herself. It was like, okay, if you don't want me, I am going to go and see some things that I want to see. And what I love about it, I love it, the mythology is wild around her. It's just wonderful. Like there's one account where Clark says, which non-native historians say is the true account. So white historians will say that Sacajewea died at the age of 23. As Clark notes it, that she was traveling with Charbonneau and she dies at the age of 23. However, so many people refute that and say that she actually died at the age of 80 on the Wind River Reservation. So this wild, isn't that like just a crazy kind of thing? Like she's Hidatsa or she's Lemmy Shoshone. She was died at the age of 23 or she lived to be 80. Her son, Baptiste, was adopted by Clark, was supposed to be well educated in Europe, came back, and there's stories that he could have been train robber in California. So these wildly sort of like stories about the whole, about her and her life seem kind of almost magically obfuscated, so that they allow for our interpretation and for us to see things. Although I think what astonishes me is how historians will say it is this with such authority, that she was Lemhi Shoshone, that she was, 12 years old. I mean, but they don't have, like, that's just speculation. And it's like writing is kind of like writing fiction is speculation. So how is that in history? How do we fix a character in history? How do we see her truly if we don't imagine her?
I think that's the beauty of books like yours and of historical fiction in general, because when someone's writing a factual biography of a person, then you have to say, okay, I found this fact in this book and I found this fact in this book. You can't, there's not the space to imagine. But then you're limited by, and in this case, by just what was in these diaries. If that's only one point of view. So I think that's a real opportunity for books like yours to imagine, okay, but if we know that this happened, if they saw the grizzly bear, but then what? How did she feel about that? Like, I think that's there's so much you can do with that in your imagination.
And the things that they were doing, like there was one encounter with a burial site of a very prominent Native woman. And she was up on a scaffold and they'd killed her horse and apparently her dog. And there was a blue jay they'd also killed. And she was just, you could, from all, even Lewis and Clark recognized that she was a powerful woman. But there they are, like kind of sniffing and poking and looking and observing something that shouldn't be observed. And I thought, here they are in this place that seems, to all accounts, sacred and something inviolate, and that you shouldn't be tromping on these grounds. Later in that same area, they camped for the evening. And this is so strange to me. The tree, and this is in the journals, a tree above Lewis and Clark's lodge, their tent, exploded in fire and toppled over, like just like set kind of this like flame down on them. It's like, okay, even there's there's occurrences of lightning striking a tree, going down to the roots, and then sort of boiling down there, and then exploding a tree.
Mm-hmm.
But that is like so coincidental, so odd, so curious. And I was thinking, oh, from my cultural perspective, I was a Bitterroot Salish woman. You should pay attention to this. This is frightening, and you're somewhere you shouldn't be. And they got that sense at different times during the, when you're reading those journals. There's things where they're a little uneasy. They're spooked by things. So I think that was so enlightening to me to read these journals. And, when you're really searching for stories and how people respond and behave, it just becomes another kind of journey through, very old, river stained pages. Like, what is this? What is this story really?
At what point did you make the decision to to write this as a book, having already, actually, you started describing sort of how you came to start thinking of her life. Can you talk about the other projects that led to this book and how it ended up being a book?
Yeah. I was invited to write about the Lewis and Clark bicentennial. And so there was a group of Native artists who had responded to the bicentennial with, beautiful works of art. And so the person who was supposed to write pulled out of the Missoula Museum of Art. And so I got a call from Laura Millen, who's the director of MAM, and she said, "Would you please write something?" And I said, "God, I know nothing about art. I'll make a fool of myself." And she said, "No, you can write anything." So I took them up and I started writing. And the weird, I guess, weird or strange or curious, writing is always strange. When I sat down to write, I wrote this thing, and probably it became the original Lost Journals of Sacajewea for my work with Peter Koch, and it was probably 30 minutes. And I just wrote it. It just exploded on the page. This voice came up out of really must have been years of thinking about November 22nd in 1804 when Sacajewea attended to the woman who was stabbed. There was something in me, and I feel like I was like the tree that exploded over Lewis and Clark, and just tumbled down with it, and set this field afire. I felt like there was a story in me that I didn't know was in me. And it came rapidly at first. And then there became times when it seemed like it was something that was tapping at me or knocking at me, or it came in sounds. And a lot of times it came in just sounds of things, a hissing, a tapping, a drum beat, a heartbeat. So in the book, I use 2 periods to represent both an ellipsis and a heartbeat, a drum beat. And when things are frightening to Sacajewea, there's a rapid heartbeat or drum beat sound in the journals themselves, in the Lost Journals of Sacajewea.
So it started with this book sort of began in this blaze of inspiration when you were working for this on this art project. And then did the story stuck with you? You thought, like, I want to explore this more?
Yes. Well, Peter Koch had his wife, Susan Filter, came up, and she saw the writing, and she grabbed him and said, you must work with this, Peter. And he's like the head of Codex and a master printer. And he said, you must do something with this. And so he contacted me, and we began a collaboration that ended up in this gorgeous, really museum piece book that has like smoked paper from Minneapolis that looks like smoked buffalo hide. And we have like bone beads and shell casings on the side. It's a really beautiful book that opens up on vellum pages so that you can see both sides of the story. Like you can see the print, and then you can see these images overlaid on the print. And it's also, he had the ability to go deep into with his equipment, to go deep into old photographs and pull out these images that had never been seen before, like the background. And there's these haunting images that he pulls out for this book. So that was what started me. But over the course of writing this, I had some experiences that I talk about, but I still feel reluctant to talk about them because they're the muse, or there's things that happen that feel strange or haunted. I woke up one night and I had a woman standing by my bed, and she was very small. Like, I just remember thinking, this is a Native woman from a long time ago. And she had this cage at her feet. And she kept pointing at this cage. I wasn't afraid. Usually I'm afraid if I see anything that's in the middle of the night, you're awoken by something. It was like, what is going on? And I had that sense of like, what is this? And I picked up a pen, and in the dark, I kind of scribbled down this piece. And then I forgot about it. I fell asleep. My mother woke me the next morning, and she said, "Hey, I have some good news for you. Did you hear that the Smithsonian has released the sacred fox of the Blackfeet? They repatriated this fox back to the Blackfeet Nation." And she goes, I just heard that this morning. And I said, Mom, I think I wrote about that. So I went back to my notes, and it was so eerie and unbelievable to me. Still, it's unbelievable to me. If I were to hear this story, I don't think I'd believe it. But there on the page was, they have captured a spirit fox. Lewis and Clark have captured a spirit fox, and I tell them to take it as far away from me as you can. Take that cage and put it away from me. And so at night, this cage finds its way back to her, and she awakens to find this fox like gnashing its teeth at this cage and biting it and speaking in the voices of these men who have abused or killed their wives, these Native men. And she asked them, like, well, who are you talking about? And the last line is, I'm talking about wife for dark nights, wife for dark nights, and it just ends like I have this whole long write-up. And I had another experience that was strange to me as well. And it was, I kept seeing this woman. And she was an ancient Mandan woman. And she lived at the edge of I kept seeing her as I was writing, living at the edge of the, like past the menstrual huts, a sacred woman who was blind, and she asked for mirrors. She had a gown that was all mirrors. And I kept seeing this woman. And when Sacajewea first sees her, whatever she thinks or asks or looks at, these mirrors light up with the story that she's talking about, or what she sees or what she thinks. And I thought, who is this woman? And this woman says, I am the woman who has always lived. And I thought, I better do some research. This is too strange. So I looked at, I just happened upon a book about Mandan cultural ceremonies, and there was the woman who has never died is one of their sacred beings, who's one of the people who guide the Mandan people. And I have never studied the Mandan. And I thought, this woman, whenever she shows up in the narrative, it's like, there she is, and she has something to say, and she's so powerful. And I think, gosh, this art of writing, this act of writing, when you open up your heart, but you also open up this other thing, the thing itself, the thing connected to something so much bigger than you. And that's what I loved about writing this, was opening up to something that was inviolate, something that I couldn't get a hold of in my sane moments. I had to enter this other place and hear this voice. And the voice, I think, in the Lost Journals of Sacajewea is very peculiar. It's not, I would say, sounds terrible, but I don't think it's reader-friendly necessarily. It asks that you be as present as Sacajewea was in her life. The words aren't given to you. I think people have told me they feel disoriented when they first began reading. And then they get, if they continue, they get the hang of it. And I'm so grateful to readers who will give it the space and time to perhaps have it not only a read, but an experiential sense within a book, to be disoriented, to be not in their element, to be as estranged as Sacajewea was.
And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Do you know what lies within nothing?
No.
Do you know where it ends? Do you want to know?
Yes. Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.
And we're back. I would concur with when I first picked up the book to read it. It took me a while to get into sort of the flow of what you were doing. Like the style of it is very, I think it's specific to this book and to this story. And then I agree, like once I sort of, okay, I get what this is doing. And then you could kind of follow it more. But yeah, I like knowing that it was sort of that experience of disorientation mirrors what Sacajewea is experiencing herself, to suddenly the world that she knew it just completely upended and nothing makes any sense. So she's just very much in the moment thinking like, well, what's going to happen now? Like,
yeah. And there's a point in this story when I heard all of the stories about Sacajewea, from the time I was very, very young. And so I had a very, very unrealistic sense of who she was. It was, almost like a cartoon character, somebody who was frivolous and at worst, somebody who was a pawn of manifest destiny, really unfair. And then as I was writing about her, and I think maybe just for me, it was an awakening to her as a real woman who had suffered and who grieved and who had lost so much. And as I was writing about her, I suddenly felt so sad about how I had viewed her for so many years. It was so unfair. Isn't it? I don't know. I think what's wonderful, no matter the truth of whatever, will we ever know the truth? There's so many stories that I've heard since I started writing this book from both the Hidatsa and my own people who have stories of Sacajewea and seeing her and the living breath of my elders. They have stories of Sacajewea. And I think, oh, we are so connected in this world. We're so connected in such beautiful and wondrous ways. And if we just stop and, begin to hold history, not just examine it, but really feel history, really try to embrace it, to see. It's just an amazing, amazing journey.
well, and that makes me wonder also about the tradition of oral storytelling in American Indian cultures, which I know a bit more, I'm in Canada, so I know a bit more about what's happening up here, but I know it's similar. And so when we're looking at, like I was saying before, if someone's writing a nonfiction book and they're looking, well, what's written? What did people write down? And the people who were writing things down were the settlers, right? Like that's who was writing things down. But there's such a rich history of the oral storytelling. So I was thinking kind of the Native women whose names I heard growing up. It's Sacajewea, it's Pocahontas, right? But I'm sure there's so many other great stories, but just they didn't happen to interact with white settlers who then wrote down their names. But those stories all exist in oral storytelling, I believe.
Yes, they do. And they're, I've heard so many powerful stories of Indigenous women. And I was fortunate enough as a young woman to be, I dropped out of high school when I was 15, and somehow I got hired at the age of 18 to be the first court advocate, which meant that I was a public defender in the tribal court system on the Flathead Reservation. So, a lot of in the lag time between court cases and everything, I got to visit with the tribal judge who was Kootenai. And she told me so many incredible stories about powerful women and women warriors and the ways in which, all the things that I would later go to college and learn and be schooled on things that weren't true at all, like the roles of women. I thought women could be warriors. They don't have to be all food gatherers. And, so it just kind of, it was, just listening to another tribal woman who's very steeped in culture tell these like incredible stories. And then to hear about Sacajewea and her story, to hear people talking about her, like somebody recently said made a comment on Facebook because one of my friends had said, "Oh, yay, I'm really looking forward to reading the Lost Journals of Sacajewea." And then she published this, I'm going to say this, rather ham-fisted and true, like representation from Publishers Weekly of, a review of Lost Journals. And it says, it just puts it out there, just kind of summarizes the novel. And this non-native man had posted and said, kind of like, who did I think I was? And that I was busting the grand mythology of Lewis and Clark, and certainly the lady, he uses the term lady, it made me laugh, like ladies Sacajewea. And I was like, wow, that is really a cultural misinterpretation of who she was, a lady. And then he said that I was guilty of presentism. And I thought, well, aren't we, like, number one, that's a racist thing to say, but aren't we all guilty of presentism in history? Like, as writers, we have to make the narrative come alive. It's our job to make it, to look back through the lens of contemporary culture and make something happen, make us feel. Yeah. So I thought, oh, and then I had another woman who was really very, very, I thought she was honest and I thought she was a good person. But when I was speaking to these booksellers at this conference recently, she came up to me and she said, "I support this novel and I support you. However, where I'm at in Montana, in my bookstore, I cannot carry this book. I cannot sell this book in my store. It would end my store. Because it's right in the heart of this real, and people just hold on to this mythology. I find that just fascinating and curious. And it seems like, if one of two things always with a novel will happen, one, it'll just slip into obscurity and no one will read it, or it will begin to spark conversations about the American West. And now whenever I see those signs like this, Lewis and Clark pointing, I just think, of all the destruction and all the devastation that occurred with Lewis and Clark. And I think of the missing and murdered Indigenous women, the trafficked women, some of the women who have not been found. And especially in Montana, we, are still searching for, many of our missing young women. And I see those signs and they're pointing, and it just is, are they pointing to the women who are lost? Where are they pointing in these signs? And they're all over the state of Montana and all through the West. You'll see the road signs of Lewis and Clark, and Lewis and Clark interpreter centers, and it all upholds this mythology of the West. And I thought, wow, there's been a reckoning in the South about the Civil War, about slavery, but there hasn't been a real reckoning in the West about what happened to Native women and what happened to tribal people. It always seems like something in the far distant past when it continues to reverberate today.
That's so interesting for you to contextualize for me, because before I read your book, well, actually, as I was reading your book, I took a pause to just learn more about Lewis and Clark, because that's not, being from Canada, that's not something I was ever taught. So I didn't realize how foundational that story is. Like, you describe it as the mythology, and it sounds like it runs so deep that to challenge that, I didn't realize how extreme people's reaction might be to a book like yours. I didn't realize how people, the importance that Lewis and Clark in that mythology, even you were just saying the road signs, like I didn't realize that it was so, it's everywhere.
Yes, it's everywhere. And plus their fingerprints, their names are on everything. They went through this country and they named everything, which is, naming and claiming things, your authorship, your control, the conquest of naming, erasing. And it's so shocking to me, really. It is so devastating, aside from the fact that, when I studied at the University of Washington, the tribes along the Columbia, there's 20 tribes that have disappeared and the languages that have gone. And so this settlement of the West also has, this idea that this God has given dominion over white, over Native people, that you conquer, you control, you subsume, you use up. And what's shocking to me is, with climate change, is that we're still like loving these myths, holding tight to these myths, like don't shake my interpretation of these myths, or don't shake this foundation. And I thought, God, it's kind of like George Washington chopped down the cherry tree or something. It's time to face some music. It's time to face the reality of some of these stories. But I think they're so deeply entrenched, maybe even more entrenched than the Confederate flag was, and hopefully is not so much anymore, but that's not what I'm hearing.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because, like, what I'm doing with the podcast and everything, I'm excited when I find there's a new book about a person, where there's a new information is found, and I'm like, oh, okay. And then I kind of recontextualize what I understand about that. And to me, that's exciting. That's interesting. And I had forgotten, or I hadn't thought about the fact that to other people, they reject new information. They don't want to learn. It's like you were taught this in the third grade, and those are the facts, and you don't want to learn anything new because you're like, no, I learned this in third grade. Like, don't tell me. So I haven't luckily encountered very many people who give me pushback about the work that I do, but I have had some people, and it's fascinating to me that it's like, no, this was disproven. Like, we know this now, but people are just like, no, like people hold tight to it. It's so different from how I think. I have to pause and remember, no, lots of other people are this different way.
And we're facing here in Montana, the state legislature is trying to legislate some kind of anti-shaming of white people, which they associate mistakenly with like telling the history from another viewpoint. That is just, they're trying to legislate that you can't shame someone, you can't tell his history in grade school. You can't, everything has to be the way that it is, that doesn't involve any kind of thing that might make somebody question what really happened in history. When you think about that, you think about these young minds and these young students sitting in a classroom, and I was one of those students, and we're fed this history. And that really is a history of erasure and shaming, which was even worse in boarding schools. like they just out and out came out and said, my mother went to a boarding school and she was told that because she was Indian, she was too stupid to learn. And so when she was in the 8th grade, a lay teacher at mission school in St. Ignatius told her, "You're too stupid to learn math, so you can clean my house and I will give you grades." So my mother's education was like cleaning house for this woman, scrubbing her floors, washing her dishes, cooking meals for her. So this kind of idea that my culture was inferior, that everything that my ancestors had taught was stupid and not worth talking about, and in some ways, like, against God somehow, that you were just so inferior, carried with my mother her whole life. And she used to say to me, when I was having trouble at university, she would say, well, you're not as smart as those white kids,
Oh no.
you just you don't have the same brain that they do. So don't be so hard on yourself. I was like, oh my God. So I'd sit in these classes sometime and think their cranial capacity maybe is larger than mine. I mean, it's just like if your parent is telling you that. And now I think, thank God, there's an incredible resurgence of language and culture and art and tradition that's happening all over the country with people who are, the Gen Xers are, and they're carrying forward something that's really, really beautiful. But I do hope that they remember that there are those of us who went through that. There's a buffer zone between, boarding school and, my generation and then theirs. I hope that history is not again erased, that there was some, there were tribes that were wiped out. As much as we have survived and thrived, there have been people who have not. And that's an important thing to remember and to continue to fight that never happens again.
I think that's so crucial to not to get into everything that's happening in the world or in the United States today. But I think so much of it is if you don't allow people to learn all aspects of history, then you can't stop people from learning. You can't stop people from being curious. You can ban a book, but people are still going to learn this information. And I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's like you can't. The spirit is always going to persist. The spirit of these stories, of the truth, quote unquote, of what really happened. I don't know. It just seems so pointless to me, all this stuff that's happening lately so in Canada, I'm sure you've heard there's it was called the residential school system up here. And there's been these horrific discoveries of bodies of children where these schools were and stuff like that. And there's people here who, in the city where I live, who are just like, oh, but it was still a good thing. Those schools were still a good thing. The people, even seeing this evidence, they're just like, oh, it's just overblown. Maybe they had influenza there or whatever. So it's like people who just can't, if you can't start even believing the evidence is being revealed now, I don't know.
Well, I'm so great. That's why I'm so grateful to vulgar history. I mean, really, we can not only read and learn and understand and get information and kind of geek out over history, but we can also just take a deep dive, take another look behind that door, lift up that skirt, look down paths and pathways that haven't not been examined before, and light up history, light up the diversity that's so rich in both Canada and America and throughout the world, and if we all had, our voices and we weren't silenced by people who, and I hate this word, people who consider themselves the conquerors, we would have such a wonderful, and we do have such a wonderful, rich history, something to talk about, great stories.
That's the thing. I'm all about as you know, listening to the podcast, like the stories, finding a person who's interesting and making it a story. And I think I find it very rewarding when I hear about, especially young people, like teenagers who I've heard who listen to my podcast. And I thought, oh, if I was 16 and I had learned these stories, how would that have changed me? How would that have shaped me if I had known that history wasn't just the stories of conquerors, white men causing wars in various places. If you knew that it was interesting and that there's been powerful and strong and problematic women in all these different cultures, I'm grateful. I'm glad to be able to let young people know that, because maybe they can take that and that'll make them develop in a different way than maybe where I did.
Yes, I think about if I had known about Sacagawea when I was a young woman, if I had heard, if I had read, if I had examined, or that this material had been given to me that made me question the narrative, I would have embraced her. I would have truly felt proud of her. But as it was, I was really kind of ashamed of her. I thought she sided with the wrong side. I thought she was responsible also for, for so much devastation and destruction. And that she was all part of that because what I had read, what historians had presented was that story, that very, very negative, very narrow interpretation of her life.
I want to talk to you forever, but I know we should wrap this up. So my question is, your book is going to be, it's going to be published. By the time that this podcast comes out, people will be able to buy and read it. And I think everybody should. What are you hoping, or what would you like to see people get out of your book, people who read it?
I hope it sparks a new conversation about those old narratives. I hope it, I think like my story of Sacagawea is just one of many. And I was recently talking to a good friend of mine who's Hidatsa, and she was saying that that the Hidatsas claim her, and that their tribal council was saying they wanted to get Elizabeth Fenn, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, to write the Sacagawea story. And I told my friend Jody, I said, why don't you write it? Like, why don't you write, like, there's as many stories about her. Why don't you open that door? I don't see, like, there's no definitive story. So what I'm hoping is that people will open their minds and open their hearts to this young woman who was really so abused, and who rose up and determined her own destiny. I mean, they don't really show that, but I was so, like, I feel like I was so proud of her when she said, I'm going to go see the whales. I mean, however she interpreted that through Hidatsa language or Shoshone, she said, I'm going to go. And I'm going to continue with you. I have my own journey. I thought that was amazing. I thought that was so uplifting and such a spirited thing. So what I'm hoping is that in all things that it begins to open up, that this book, which is such a small book, and in the history, such a great, huge history, but I do hope that it does make it into the hands, even with its slaughter names for women, that it makes it into the hands of a young person who says, there's something different here. There's something I should explore in my own history. And, that's a grand desire, the biggest hope.
I would love for there to be, like you were saying, you encourage your friend, why don't you write this book also? How many books are there, novels even, just about someone like Anne Boleyn or someone like that? It's like, there doesn't need to just be one book about one person. Yeah.
Or, well, you look at Sacagawea, there's walls of books. Like, there's a wall of books for, on Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea, and there's all, and, you look at that and you think, well, there's nothing more that I can write here. So I'm going to, But that's where I think that's where maybe we all make these mistakes, but young writers make that mistake in particular, is looking at these wall of books and saying, I have nothing to add to the conversation here. When you have everything to add to the conversation there, there's a crack, there's a seam, there's a place when you can enter into history and you can see it anew and you can look at it with fresh eyes. If you're trusting these old fusty historians who looked at this material and who make these outrageous claims, like Ambrose made this claim, and he was the definitive book, Undaunted Courage, on, the travels of Lewis and Clark and the expedition. He made this claim, and I'm just paraphrasing here, but it was like really celebrating these men because, they had not done anything to this Sacajewea as they were traveling. These men, he didn't say these randy men, but the gist of it was that, they didn't rape her as they were going along. It's not terrific.
Good for them. Wow.
Yeah.
That's the bare minimum of humanity. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I'm hoping is, gosh, in all of these things, absolutely. I think that the person that has been written the most about is where you should go and see, turn over those books, look under there, because there's so much to discover.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. This was such a treat. I was so excited to talk to you, and this lived up to my expectations.
I was just so excited to talk to you, and I'm thrilled. Thank you so much for seeking me out and for putting me on your podcast. I'm grateful.
So again, Debra's book is called The Lost Journals of Sacajewea, and that is available everywhere. And I really encourage you to read it. It's such a good and interesting book, and really just tilts the focus of the narrative that has been so mainstream for so long, where it's like Lewis and Clark were these great white men, and Sacajewea was just kind of helping them out, to be like, actually, no, that's actually not what was going on. Making her the main character, I think, is such an important reframing of this historical situation. So this is Vulgar History. My name is Ann Foster, and so you can keep up with this podcast. We're on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod, on TikTok at Vulgar History. There's a website, vulgarhistory.com, where if you go there, we're starting to slowly but surely get some transcripts of these episodes. So if you prefer to read an episode, or if you want to go back and see it in words, those are going to be showing up pretty soon. And the transcriptions are being done by Aveline Malik from The Wordery. And also, I have a Patreon, patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter, and that is where I share early ad-free access to all of the episodes, as well as special Patreon-only series, like So This Asshole, talking about gross men from history. Perhaps I will do Lewis and Clark, Lewis and or Clark, or both of them. At some point, I have talked about Hernan Cortez, Christopher Columbus. So I'm ready to explore some more sort of people who have been celebrated for their explorations when actually they were shitty people. Anyway, that's all on patreon.com. And otherwise, we're going to be back next week with some more of the Mary Queen of Scots series. And until then, all my friends, please keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Ann Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth.
Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Contained herein are the heresies of Radolf Buntwine, erstwhile monk turned traveling medical investigator. Join me as I study the secrets of the divine plagues and uncover the blasphemous truth that ours is not a loving God, and we are not its favored children. The Heresies of Redolf Buntwine, wherever podcasts are available.